a moment in honoring a phenomenologist. I'm going to start by asking an important question, which is, does anybody recognize any important absences? All of the important things are also the present things. Excellent. All right, and we'll let people, of course, you to come in. Thanks everybody for being here. It's wonderful to take a minute at the end of the semester to get together, and doubly wonderful to do so to honor somebody who's so important to me, to the philosophy department, and who has been so important to Rice University. The Joseph and Joanna Nazro Mullen Professor of Philosophy, Steve Crowell. I remember thinking as an undergraduate that there were like many things that I was allowed to say in a philosophy class. I could just kind of talk about whatever ideas I had on my mind, and professors would indulge me if I just really wanted to stay on a point. The liar's paradox is a trick, and all of that. But of course, there were a lot of things I didn't feel I could say. I didn't feel like I could address my professors by their actual names, and had to like keep my tongue about all kinds of topics. I thought, well, you know, if I ever start grad school, I'll be able to like talk with my professors as peers and so on. And it was true, I could use the first names of my instructors and be welcomed into the community of philosophers. That was wonderful. But of course, there were still some things that I didn't want to say, that I couldn't broach, that I kept quiet. And I thought, well, you know, of course, when I get a job, I'll have a lot of stability. Then I'll really be free. So then I was hired at the University of Manitoba, and that was a wonderful place to have a career, and everybody was very nurturing. Oh, Tim, you know, it's so great that you're here, and what do you think about this, and should we change that? The youth are the future of the department. And so that was wonderful, but I still couldn't say, like, absolutely everything. You know, if the dean came and gave us some bad advice, I was going to hold my tongue and all of that. I thought, well, but when I'm tenured, and then, well, when I'm a full professor, then I'll be able to say what I really think. Of course, there are still consequences to what I say. I give you the man who has nothing to lose. Steve Crowell. He doesn't really need an introduction, but in this life, we get many things that we don't need. Some of them are unwelcome, some of them are very welcome. An introduction will be one of those things. Professor Charles Seward, the Department of Philosophy.
Okay, I've actually prepared some remarks, but as you can see, they're not very long. So, I salute Tim's great extemporaneous thing, but I don't trust myself. But here we go. So I'm sure you're eager, as am I, to hear what hard-won insights Steve Crowell has to share with us. So I promise not to take long. But I didn't want to pass up this special chance to offer a few words of appreciation for someone I'm privileged to have as a friend and a colleague. I knew Steve for some time before I came to Rice 12 years ago, and he had a good deal to do with why I wanted to come here, and has had much to do with why I'm glad I did. In addition to the sheer fun of hanging out with him, I have benefited enormously from our philosophical discussions and from his counsel in practical matters, personal and professional. For Steve comes as close as anyone I know to being a phronimos. Yes, a phronimos. As many of you here know, that's the word Aristotle used to describe the practically wise person. The person with excellence of mind and decision-making, someone optimally skilled at discerning what's relevant to choosing well in an open-ended variety of situations, in a way that resists being spelled out in rules and unites right reason, right action, and right feeling. Aristotle commonsensically recognizes that this quality, practical wisdom, is to be distinguished from wisdom in purely theoretical matters. Both forms of intelligence are not often enough combined as happily as they are in Steve Crowell. My talk of wisdom may evoke for you the image of a dispassionate sage, but that notion of wisdom, more stoic than Aristotelian, is not one I mean to attach to Steve. Someone who is hardly devoid of passion. But for Aristotle, at least, not even ideally wise people are free of passion. They are not, for example, free of anger, and, well, neither is Steve. Of course, just being angry is no great thing. Outrage seems to be an especially cheap commodity these days. But what I find remarkable about Steve is something much less common, and that is his surprising way of combining a passionate nature with a fine sense of diplomacy, timing, and proportion. A rare blend that surely helped him chair the philosophy department so effectively for so many years in a way I know that has been deeply appreciated by those who worked with him. That point opens on to my final theme. Unlike the self-indulgently passionate people so thick on the ground nowadays, Steve is distinguished by a deep sense of self-responsibility. In every facet of his life, it seems to me, he asks much of himself. He doesn't let himself off easily. This strength of character is part of why he strikes me as an unusually authentic person. You are authentically committed to the norms by which you would judge people, I'd say, only to the extent you, like Steve, apply them unflinchingly to yourself. And while there is undoubtedly more to authenticity than just this, as Steve could tell you, that alone is cause enough for admiration in this world. My praise here for Steve for his combination of practical and theoretical intelligence, for his passion, for his authenticity, I'm afraid, make him sound as teutonically serious as some of the thinkers he's devoted much of his career to studying. So let me make it clear, if you don't know it already, as serious as Steve is about philosophy, he's also completely hilarious, as probably no one ever said about Martin Heidegger. This draws my inadequate, if earnest, panegyric to a close. Without further delay, I present to you, with pleasure, a distinguished, internationally esteemed philosopher, a devoted and beloved educator, an invaluable colleague, a career-long boon to Rice University, a champion of genuine intellectual values, someone I'm lucky to call a friend, total mensch, an all-around cowboy, Professor Stephen G. Crowell.
It's a great good fortune to have a scholar of the ancient world introduce you. Never heard such things before, but this is really hard. I'm of course pleased and delighted that you all come here, and I promise to do the best I can on reading my paper. I'm a reader. I use no technology if I can possibly help it. But reading without speeding is hard for me too. But I want to thank Tim and Charles for those kind words, and my gratitude for being their colleagues is deep. My first and deepest thanks is to my wife, Liz, who makes every day a joy to wake up. And we're very proud to have her sons and daughter-in-laws. She welcomed me into her family, Emily and Christian, and Alex and Christina, and Johnny and August, our grandsons. So that's a treat for me. All of my family's in California, and I get to see them on breaks. You know? There are some benefits to being retired. I'm no longer on an academic schedule, and I will be able to hit the slopes when it's not so crowded. You know? Yeah, again, it's a strange place for me to be. The last time I was in this room was teaching my last class on Thursday, and it's hard to say those words, last class. Yeah, you never know what the future's going to bring, but they felt like the last one to me. And after 39 years of being at home in the classroom at Rice University, leaving home will be a little bit difficult. I can take comfort in the fact, I guess, that no one ever really leaves home. So I'll be around. So today I just decided I wanted to just share a few thoughts that I've been toying with for a long time. And in order to not, I guess, drag this out too long, I better get to it. Because I tend not to know where to cut. But I promise you, I've already cut a lot of stuff down. So we'll see how it goes. I need to put a timepiece here, and I'll just begin. You'll bear with me. So the title of my talk is Philosophy, the Humanities, and the University, an Elegiac Encomium. I will explain as I go. But the first little section, this is like 4 sections. The first one is little, small. Third one is long. This one is All You Need Is Love. When I arrived at Rice in 1983, interviewing for a position whose duties included 2 semesters in a new interdisciplinary humanities program, I met not only with philosophy faculty, Baruch Brody, Larry Temkin, Richard Grandy, Tris Engelhardt, Mark Kolstad, Konstantin Kalenda, but also with faculty from other departments in the Humanities division, as it was known then. Dean Alan Matisow, Tom Haskell, Wes Morris, Terry Duty, Dennis Houston, and in the Dean's office, the inimitable Linda Quady. Yes, all but one were men, but that would change dramatically in years to come. Maybe it was the gorgeous February weather, a sparkling contrast to my sojourn in the Bronx. Maybe it was being domiciled in the elegant Shamrock Hotel with its storied history. Or maybe it was Rice's architecture, designed by Ralph Adams Cram, my grandfather's teacher at MIT. But what charmed me the most about the place, I think, were the people I met. At my job talk, I was introduced to James Street Fulton, then retired, a philosopher whose work I'd encountered as an undergraduate. This unexpected connection was magical. When Richard Grandy later called to offer me the job, I felt myself in very heaven. Teaching 2 courses in philosophy and 2 courses that included classics, literature, history, religion, and art was my dream job. And during the span of the Humanities program, 10 plus years of shape-shifting existence, I met and learned from numerous brilliant colleagues, many of whom became good friends. To give shout outs to all of them, some gone, some present among us right now, would be a pleasure, but the list is long. You know who you are, and I love you all. Rice today is a very different place than it was during my early years, and it's tempting to spend some time commenting on those changes, good and bad. But as I ride off into the sunset, I want to reflect more generally on philosophy, the humanities, and the university. I think of this as an encomium. Rice was and is a special place of welcoming and civil home for research, teaching, and learning. But my encomium will have a somewhat elegiac tone. I admit that I speak from a place of privilege, aware that others, many more talented than I, have had a harder time making their voices heard. But there's no need to denigrate what has mattered to me for the sake of recognizing what matters to others. Nor is my Eurocentrism in need of apology. Most of what I say today originated in 2 meetings, one at Rice and the other at Leipzig, of the Rice-Leipzig Lovett Seminar, organized on our side by Christian Emden and Uwe Steiner. I study European philosophy, its history, and its dissemination in the field today. We all have limits. No one can do serious work in everything. No one need apologize for their scholarly identity, at least as long as inquiry is up to the inquirer. The free exchange of ideas is the core of a university, and we owe our students only the space to explore those ideas for themselves, That and the humility to acknowledge that we too remain students. The 1980s culture of suspicion fostered many salutary changes in university life. Among them, Rice's expanding commitment to diversity and inclusion. Everything has its time and place. But as I see it, critique of ideology can also marginalize what is distinctive about the humanities. In 2 words, love and beauty. These enduring goods are not excluded from today's humanities, of course, but they often seem to take a backseat while the political issues are being sorted out. Following in the footsteps of Uwe Steiner's recent Abschiedsrede, then, an eloquent tribute to philology, or love of the word, I would like to add something about the love found in the name of my own field, philosophy, or love of wisdom, Sophia. Yeah, love wisdom. Karl Jaspers called it a loving struggle, alluding once more to the erotic agon already classically expressed in Plato's Phaedrus. But really, the humanities are all about love, idea, Bildung. And this is something other than love of knowledge. If I have a thesis, it is this. The humanities cultivate judgment, they cannot pass judgment. To be sure, scholars in the humanistic disciplines engage in critique, criticism, critical theory, but cultivating judgment is a precondition for that. And it cannot be taught as a kind of technical skill, even a critical one. We humanists are here to acknowledge just how much human beings cannot know. If my encomium has an elegiac tone, then, it is because it recalls what is lost, or what can be lost, when the authority of knowledge and theory is prioritized over the cultivation of judgment, the indispensable task of the humanities. We might put the matter this way. Of course, there is a place in the university for humanists to engage in interdisciplinary and applied work. Medical humanities, digital humanities, business ethics, environmental studies, data ethics, whatever. Actually, we're everywhere. But such work is not like applied physics or like crossing bio, nano, techno. Why not? I'll get to that. But second, it's my party and I'll cry if I want to. General education and great books are back in the news. Rice is once again debating its distribution requirements, and a spate of recent articles in generalist publications revisit issues that will be utterly familiar to those of us who taught humanities in the 1980s and 90s. Commenting on a book by Columbia Core professor Roosevelt Montas, who defends the great books approach as part of a liberal education, Louis Menand objects that the whole business is ineffable. Though he teaches such a course himself, Menand does not think that it has made him a better person. Humanists cannot win what he calls the war against science in this way. Rather, quote, they need to connect with disciplines outside the humanities to get out of their silos. Why? Because students will better learn empathy by taking classes that study actual human behavior, not fictional characters in literature. John McWhorter, in turn, doubts that such work has not made Menand a better person. Non-specialist teaching and debating a book like Rousseau's Social Contract allows students and professors to experience the questionability of the issue under consideration, and this makes us better because we come to understand the complexity of the real world, quote, something that escapes ideologues of all kinds. Leonard Cassuto in the Chronicle is even more direct. Menand lost his cool. The modern university is grounded in 3 imperatives: research, utility, and liberal thought, which all compete for resources. Today, utility is ascendant. Let's call it job credentialing. Next in line for resources is research, Menand's idea that students should take courses from specialists. Apart from the fact that most universities cannot afford to hire specialists in every area, this approach, according to Cassuto, leaves out the role of pleasure in learning, love, eros. The joy that comes from insights not bound to utility and expertise. It is this latter point that I want to explore. In doing so, I shall leave aside the question of what makes us better people. What does this mean, anyway? Better at what? Or better for what? Currently, at Rice, the resource wars are being won by research, that is, by the STEM fields, and the imperatives of liberal thought are being funded under the heading of utility or application. The humanistic discipline's survival thus depends on how well they can contribute to the aforementioned connection with other fields. For philosophy, that ultimately means ethics, because other branches of philosophy, in their handmade to the sciences role, have little directly to contribute to the actual research projects of the sciences. There's nothing worrying in this situation as far as it goes. We do need to think about ethical issues in the projects we take on, but there's no special knowledge in the way that a knowledge in chemistry can contribute directly to some project in biology. Philosophers think about ethical issues in a systematic way, but there are no results that can simply be applied. Hence Menon's advice that students take courses in the social sciences instead. How should we think about this situation? As a start, I want to reflect on some imperatives of humanistic research and teaching that receive short shrift when application reigns supreme. Eventually, and with a tear in my eye, I will try to explain that what is at stake here, the vita contemplativa. But since it's my party, I'll begin by narcissistically engaging in a little autobiography. At UC Santa Cruz, I wrote a senior thesis on the dispute between Philip Rieff and Norman O. Brown over the role of teachers. Rieff argued that the teacher's role was essentially interdictory, to inculcate in students a discipline that did not come naturally. Brown, in contrast, whom Rieff called a guru of the endless expressional quest, was all about liberating love's body from just such interdicts. Sheldon Mullen had recently published Politics and Vision. This was about the same time that Rawls's theory of justice appeared. And when he visited campus for a talk, Brown introduced him by saying, "I like the vision part, the politics not so much." My response to all this was, here's the Teutonic, phenomenology, whose practice, both interdictory and liberating, I learned from Maurice Nathanson and have come to see as attention to the inconspicuous. Another thesis then, meaning is the inconspicuous, and this is what is specifically at issue in humanistic study. When I arrived at Yale as a graduate student, however, meaning was in retreat, the target of an almighty deconstruction. Since there are no positive terms, but only a play of differences, affirmation is always only exclusion of something. Thus, criticism would ultimately settle for a political portfolio. But while it may be true that there are no positive terms in language as a system of signs, it is not true of meaning, which has a different geography. Nothing outside the text? We know that's not true, but it seems that way because all our work on texts produces more texts. How should we think about the extra-textual geography of meaning? I've found it useful to recall that criticism, also means recognizing what is great, excellent, arete. Even in a work that otherwise offends one's political sensibility, Hume judged Greek tragedy tasteless for its morals. Kant corrected him. Aesthetic judgment is independent of moral judgment. A work is great because it is unavoidable, and if we exclude the unavoidable or teach it only for what it excludes, we and our students will lose our nose for it. To support this point, I will argue that there are two ways in which a text might be deemed great or unavoidable, as canonical and as a classic. The canonical and the classic are different ways in which the geography of meaning can manifest itself, and both require us to recognize a mode of thinking that can flourish only where space is made for the vita contemplativa. This fact will go some way toward explaining why it is hard to find a place for the humanities in the university today. So, the third section on the very idea of the canonical. To an American professor of my generation, reflection on the humanities and their place in the university will recall the culture wars of the 1980s. The field of philosophy was relatively untouched by the debates that transformed and diversified other humanities departments such as English, history, art history, religion, and the study of languages and literatures. Why is that? One way to tell the story of that time, early examples being books like Roger Kimball's Tenured Radicals and Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, is to say that a cohort of left-leaning professors and their graduate students who had come of age in the 1960s hoped to carry on the revolution by other means. Emphasizing the political elements that can be found in anything read and taught in the university, these engaged intellectuals rejected as abstract or ideological all arguments in defense of other humanistic concerns, for instance, the love in philosophy and philology, and instead focused on and taught their students to focus on the relations of power and domination reflected in any text. Though few were existentialists, many nevertheless appeared to embrace Sartre's dictum that the only question that matters regarding a piece of writing is whether it is for freedom, that is, targets some form of oppression. Under such circumstances, the term canon became ambiguous. On the one hand, its relationship with authority was immediately suspect. If certain texts have been canonized in the curriculum, this must be because they serve the interests of a political hegemon whose oppressive functioning should be brought to light. On the other hand, canon could be named that into which any number of formerly excluded voices were to be inducted. If the old canon included only the voices of dead white males, the new canon would contain multitudes. Since this idea has become the default for humanistic education today, it might be time to take a new, if necessarily retrospective, look at the very idea of the canonical. To simplify, I will focus on two related questions that show us something interesting about the canonical. First, what is the difference between a canonical text and a classic? And second, why didn't the field of philosophy undergo the kind of change in curriculum that roiled other fields in the humanities? Yes, I know, there are lots of approaches to both questions, but bear with me, please. To address the first question, I will draw on the history of the idea of the canonical found in Ernst Robert Curtius's classic study, European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages. Published in 1948 and framed on the one hand by a deep sense of crisis, and on the other, by Goethe's grand hopes for world literature, Curtius's book represents perhaps the last authentic expression of the belief that education is fundamentally the responsibility of literature, grammar, ars poetica. Such had been the view during the post-Hellenistic age, lasting until roughly the 12th century, a period, as he says, when philosophy was too high a form of intellectual calling, literacy itself being rare. And it was also, not coincidentally, the view of the high modernists like Eliot and Pound, both of whom looked back behind scholasticism and its Enlightenment aftermath, toward an age in which culture, tradition, news that stays news, was transmitted primarily through literature. The Europe that was being blown to pieces in world wars was beginning to look very like the Europe that had not yet formed, when emerging vernacular languages and literatures gathered what they could from the Latin heritage in centuries of broken, almost blind transmission of ancient Romanian. For post-war humanists like Curtius, it could appear that, quote, the formation of a canon serves to safeguard a tradition, end quote, and that nothing could be more important than to preserve the remnants of the secular canon while making it new. This meant overcoming the virus which since the 16th century had sapped the strength of learning, namely science and philosophy, or science philosophy. Neither Pound nor Eliot had any use for the scientific culture around them, and as for Curtius, he consistently denounced the hair-splitting arguments and contempt for grammar shown by the raving dialecticians of the 12th century, who, he said, would become the philosophers, existentialists, and others of today. These scientists rejected the very foundation of humanistic education, the idea that, quote, poetry has a cognitive function. Pound, in his ABC of Reading, saw the problem explicitly as one of forming a new curriculum. But in doing so, this modernist found himself embroiled in a recrudescence of the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns, and by no means on the side of the latter. If the transition from the Latin Middle Ages to the High Middle Ages can be traced to the sway of dialectic in the schools, then an escape from the techno-military industrial consequences of the triumph of science would have to come by restoring grammar, poetry, imaginative literature to its rightful place. Curtius pined for, quote, a convergence of our knowledge of nature and our knowledge of history into a new open picture of the universe where the creative function that yields poetry could be seen as an imaginative power which attests itself in the whole realm of life. But he was skeptical. This efflorescence of ancient thinking against modernity was partly responsible for the high church sensibility that characterized English departments before the 1960s. And it was this idea of aesthetic knowledge embodied in a secular canon which was swept away by the tenured radicals, all of them moderns driven by science or theory. As Harold Bloom laments in his late elegiac reflection on the culture wars, the aesthetically normative sense of the term canon, the key to a literary education that is more than criticism of books and authors, will be preserved only in the university's interstices. Quote, when our English departments and other literature departments shrink to the dimensions of our current classics departments and cede their grosser functions to the legions of cultural studies, we will perhaps be able to return to the study of the inescapable. If you read Bloom, you can hear the cadences up and down the block. So what then are we saying when we call something canonical? Curtius informs us that a canon is a rule in the sense of a measuring rod, and the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages knew three traditions that employed canons: the literary, the juristic, and the religious. Our interest in the first and third of these. Originally an oral phenomenon, according to Curtius, the Christian religion eventually came to require the formation of a biblical canon, distinguishing between authoritative texts of the faith and the many other artifacts associated with it: Apocrypha, Agraphia, Acts of the Apostles, epistles, apocalypses, all kinds of them. In the fullness of time, the term came to name those clergy who were installed according to the laws, canons of the church in a process of canonization. And ultimately, the process of adjudicating the merits of a claim to sainthood. So a canon is a catalog, whether of persons or texts, with authority in respect of some project, here religious. And to canonize something is to judge a thing's claim to that authority, whether through a juridical process or, as we shall see, in some other way. Can a literary tradition be safeguarded in a canon? Again, as Curtius informs us, the notion of a literary canon in the sense of a catalog of pagan auctores who serve as measures in matters of faith, matters of grammar and rhetoric, excuse me. This idea is first found in the 4th century. More interesting, because it involves a crossing of the religious tradition with the literary, is the process whereby what Curtius calls the medieval canon took shape. Having initially rejected the pagan literary tradition, the church came ultimately to embrace it. Pagan myth was no longer necessarily subject to Christian correction, thereby authorizing the new form of literary tradition taking shape in imaginative writing. But we cannot explore the details of that history. Here, a couple of things should be noted. First, the medieval canon was ahistorical. That is, canonical authors, whether pagan or Christian, stood side by side. This encouraged stylistic and generic mashups in which Christian themes were couched in pagan tropes, and pagan writings were reinterpreted through Christian templates. Second, Dante's Divine Comedy, a masterly exemplar of this canonical form, becomes a classic precisely because it appears at the moment of this period's Untergang, decline. As Curtius writes, the downfall of the medieval canon is the reverse side of the brilliant period of learning brought about by in the age of the universities. That is, by the triumph of dialectic, philosophy, and science. Over the auctores, right? literature. From that moment on, the literary tradition and its canon shifted to the separate vernacular languages. Achieving its apotheosis in 17th century French classicism, the secular or modern canon no longer played a central role in the other two European traditions, the juridical state and the religious church, both of which had long since become dependent on philosophical modes of legitimation. So the literary canon came to be recognized for what it was, a repository of the aesthetic. The question of the canon's place in education would henceforth be linked to the fate of the aesthetic, as in German Romanticism's desire to develop a unified philosophico-poetic canon. But it seems that there cannot be a philosophical canon. And the reason suggests an answer to our second question. Why is it that philosophy departments in the 1980s did not exhibit the same anxiety over canon formation that beset many other humanities departments? The reason, I suggest, has largely to do with the occulted role that exemplarity plays in philosophical and scientific study. In the study of literature, what is authoritative is necessarily embodied in individual items, a work, an oeuvre. And any rules derived therefrom are nothing without the direct experience of the work's exemplary aesthetic virtue. As Curtius put it, spiritual treasures cannot be connected to the standard of a common currency. That is, quote, regarded as an example of a and Kant concurs, that's right, he concurs with Curtius on this. The necessity found in an aesthetic judgment, Kant says, can only be called exemplary. That is, regarded as an example of a universal rule that we cannot state. In both science and philosophy, in contrast, the former definitively, the latter more ambiguously, the exemplary is only an example, stating the rule it exemplifies being the main thing. Thus, these fields substitute the authority of reasoning for the authority of the canonical work. A scientific or philosophical tradition, if one can call it that, can acknowledge no canonical texts because texts have no authority, no exemplary necessity in the projects pursued by science and philosophy. Though there are important historical examples of philosophizing, Plato's Republic, Hume's Treatise, these texts belong neither to a biblical canon, distinguishing what has the authority of Scripture from what does not, nor to a literary canon, taken as models for nachahmung or emulation, as Kant puts it. This is because their textuality is subordinated from the outset to a project, inquiry, whose stakes are tied to the dialectical skill or practice of reasoning. It is reasoning as such that provides the rule of how to go on in this tradition, nothing that is peculiar to this or that canonical text. To put it in terms I will return to shortly, Harold Bloom's terms, philosophy is incapable of producing a canon because neither of the two processes that lead to canonization of texts, the agon between poet and precursor and criticism, are available to it. Instead, philosophy's relation to texts is always mediated by its relation to truth. The contemporaneity which philosophy creates among philosophers of all eras is not grounded in any exemplary textual forms, myths, genres, or grammars, but in the norms of inquiry. Kant makes just this point in his chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason entitled The Canon of Pure Reason. There is a philosophical canon, but it is not a list of authoritative texts. Rather, it is, quote, quoting Kant, the sum total of the a priori principles of the correct employment of certain faculties of knowledge. Critique of Pure Reason is a page turner. What look like canonical texts in philosophy, the Nicomachean Ethics, for example, or Descartes' Meditations, are not really canonical. They are classics. That there is a difference between a canonical text and a classic one is one reason why the culture wars had only a marginal effect on the philosophical curriculum, though a somewhat larger effect on the composition of philosophy departments. It avails nothing to argue that a text in philosophy should be canonized. included in the curriculum as an exemplar to be emulated, since no text in philosophy claims the authority of an exemplar, and so no process, whether juridical, critical, or agonistic, can establish such authority or canonical status for it. In philosophy, even the fact that a work is a classic does not provide it with canonical authority. Why not? If, as Curtius informs us, quote, canon formation in literature must always proceed to a selection of classics, then a text is a classic on its own terms. For this reason, not every canonical text needs to be a classic, need be a classic. If a canonical text is an authoritative exemplar for how to go on in a certain literary tradition, there can be many such exemplars which nevertheless lack certain features that would make them classics. What are those features? Günter Figal offers some plausible candidates. Figal's understanding of what makes a text a classic involves some of the features belonging to the canonical. First, a classic presents itself as unavoidable. For those engaged in a certain project, both the classic and the canonical text are, as Bloom puts it, inescapable. Second, a classic inspires our awe and wonder, but not merely in the manner of a magic trick, with its imposing mastery of a skill or craft, techne. The canonical involves such mastery, indeed it is perhaps its most salient feature, while the classic may involve it. But either way, the classic invites judgment of a different sort, beyond its art. It is open to critical challenge. Such criticism is the thoughtful engagement with the text, one that insists on understanding and so measuring for itself the text's normative claim to achieve a certain disclosive power. In a classic, the previously inconspicuous meaning of some matter comes conspicuously into view. Here, techne, the concern of philology, serves what we might call the idea. A classic does not close in on itself as an expression of an alien subjectivity. It makes a redeemable claim to reveal something about the world and ourselves in it. If this is the decisive difference between the classic and the canonical, Figal goes one step further when he argues that because a classic is ontologically disclosive, it can serve as a canon for how to go on in philosophy too. For instance, he takes Aristotle's work to show, quote, in an exemplary way, how to inquire into what human life is. But even if we agree that canonical texts can be ontologically disclosive, a philosophical classic cannot have this sort of exemplarity that Figal describes to it here. This is because a classic text is tied to an historical period, whereas the exemplarity of the canonical, no matter the historicity of its origins, cannot be tied to a particular historical period. The historicity of the classic lies in its being an exemplary reminder of the powers and possibilities of its own time, the way Dante's poem seems to incorporate and fulfill what earlier attempts at the project had been striving for. Following Eliot, Figal calls this feature of the classic maturity, or rife. The sort of thing, for instance, that distinguishes the way philosophy's possibilities are developed in Plato and Aristotle from that of Heraclitus and Parmenides, exploratory originators of the project of philosophical inquiry. A classic differs from the canonical in just this aspect, since a canonical text, one with authority concerning how to go on in a certain project, need not be a fully mature example of that project, though it certainly might be. If something like this is correct, then we can understand why philosophical classics do not constitute a canon. Aristotle's example of how to inquire into human life may draw together the deepest possibilities of his age and exhibit the most mature form of philosophical inquiry available to it, but it doesn't constrain us in our own practice of philosophy. It is not unavoidable in the manner of something that authoritatively determines how we are to inquire into life. The reason is that nothing, that is, no text, can do that. Nevertheless, the extensive overlap between the classic and the canonical explains why philosophy's way of dealing with its classics often looks like canon formation. Philosophers often do pursue systematic issues in dialogue with classic texts, but this dialogue is often deeply misunderstood, dismissed as mere history of philosophy. A sign on the door of the late Princeton philosopher Gilbert Harman supposedly read, quote, "History of philosophy, just say no." Robert Pippin's engagement with Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is no mere history of philosophy, of course, but nor is Harman's analytic dissection of thought merely a series of footnotes to Plato, as the historians might counter, were philosophy's relation to its classics really a relation to a canon. But what is it then that turns a classic text, or any text, into a canonical one? How is it that it can be recognized and established as an authoritative measure of how to go on in a certain practice? For Harold Bloom, as for Curtius, the Western canon arises within the project of imaginative literature, safeguarding the literary tradition as an irreplaceable mode of knowledge. For Curtius, this knowledge is essential. Quote, "The lesson of the Latin Middle Ages is reverent reception and faithful transmission of a precious posit." Whereas, as he says, European philosophies are doomed, so it seems, to be short-lived. Got that right? And in Bloom's catalog of the modern canon, there are poets, including Freud, a strong poet in his lexicon, but no philosophers, except in the liminal case of Emerson. We've seen one reason why this might be so. In any case, according to Bloom, those who wish to achieve glory in a project measured by a canon might demand with Artaud that, quote, "the dead poets consent to stand aside for them." But they find that, as Bloom puts it, this is exactly what they will not consent to do. The dead poet stands there, or rather her achievement does, as an eternal provocation, barring access to immortality, as does Kafka's gatekeeper, who guards a door intended only for you. The question of the canonical, then, is what Bloom calls the grim triple question of the agonist. Are you more than, less than, or equal to? Such a contest is anything but inclusive. Instead, as Heraclitus divined, is the essence of discrimination, ausanagazetsu, or polemos, the father of us all. Well, some he shows as gods, other as men. Some he makes slaves, others free. The dead poets must be made to yield in an individual contest with them, and canonization is for the victors. In philosophy, it's otherwise. While philosophy acknowledges a history, it is also capable of setting its own dead poets entirely aside to cultivate reason's ingrown amnesia. That aspect of its project in which it is most like the sciences of nature. There is no canonical text in physics, though physics cannot do without its past. And in philosophy, too, the amnesia of reason supports itself by an appeal to public accountability and confirmation that is excluded by the kind of truth at stake in the literary project. For Bloom, such truth is the yield of solitary energies, not the reflection of social energies belonging to our time and place. It is the achievement of individuality, the result of an anxious confrontation with morality, with mortality, and its memorializing aspirations, without which, he says, we cease to think. Bloom's invocation of death, achieved individuality, and anxiety might appear idiosyncratic, but it contains a significant insight into the very idea of the canonical. Namely, that the primary way in which a text of imaginative literature becomes canonical is that it shows itself over time to be an unavoidable marker in the artist's quest to be an artist. The canonical is the inescapable precursor, and while it can be incorporated into a list of such precursors, a canonical text is not, first of all, one that everyone ought to read, nor primarily one that happens to safeguard a tradition. These social aspects of canon formation can be deconstructed, their hegemonic function exposed by critical theory, but such approaches cannot substitute for the primary process of canonization, the text's resistance to being overcome in the contest with strong poets, writers, thinkers, who find its achievement unavoidable in their own identity formation. A tragedy or a sonnet by Shakespeare is not canonical because it has been force-fed to generations of students, but because generations of aspiring poets have felt themselves chosen by Shakespeare's achievement, challenged by it to a contest in which the stakes are immortality, that is, normatively becoming what one is, or death. Thus, it is entirely unpredictable which texts will acquire canonical status, since one cannot predict which ones will compel writers, thinkers, and poets to struggle with them for the sake of being writers, thinkers, and poets. In contrast, nothing is easier than to add texts to the syllabus, texts which represent all kinds of social facts on the ground or illustrate the ideology of one's choice. The canonical is necessarily exclusive, since it is the result of a contest that cannot be rigged. Success in an artistic project, something productive of what Bloom calls aesthetic value, or the poetic as a mode of cognition in Curtius, is not a matter for legislation, nor is it judged on the basis of moral or political criteria. It is decided only in the contest, the outcome of which can be assessed, if at all, only by a critic whose standard of taste includes a nose for such contests. Thus, as Bloom puts it, the demand to open up the canon is really a call to destroy it. Not because what gets included is somehow not worthy, but because the demand misunderstands what the canonical is. As Frank Grimaud observed, the defense of canons, quote, cannot be any longer undertaken by central institutional powers. They cannot any longer be compulsory, though it's hard to see how normal operations of learned institutions can manage without them. But of course, the culture wars were all about what to teach, not about what belongs in the canon. The term canon was always used either cynically or ironically. The inclusion of excluded or overlooked literature was sometimes justified by the claims for its aesthetic indispensability, but more often the argument turned on the quite reasonable claim that it would benefit students to read works that belong to a wide variety of cultures and voices. Aesthetic arguments are always available, but during the culture wars, and still today, maybe, I don't know, aesthetic criteria or indicators of poetic truth were quite out of fashion, treated as masks for suspect ideologies. Fortunately, we can teach whatever we want, at least for now, but this does not mean that we will have formed a new canon. And if we don't understand the idea of the canonical in the terms that belong to it, we shall leave out of what we teach what this term indicates, no matter what we call it. Curtius feared an age of impending barbarism. Bloom finds himself in the midst of that very age. This anxiety or dread of leaving out the essential underwrites Bloom's apocalyptic criticism and informs his monastic metaphors. The eventual absence from our curriculum of genuinely canonical works will take its toll, no matter what sort of social reforms attend the deconstruction of canonicity as a tool of hegemony. If we accept Kant's insight that aesthetic exemplarity is not a generic property, but is tied to specific works, we have to admit that canonization through strong criticism in Bloom's aesthetic sense, the only kind that we as teachers, rather than aspiring poets, can hope to engage in, is already secondary, already partly a function of those social energies that flee the open sea of individual agon for the safe haven of the spectator. However necessary such flight might be if the canonical is to serve the role that Curtius cherished in the medieval canon, namely preserving and enriching a tradition, a canon in the modern sense is grounded in the struggle to achieve individuality as the aspiring poet experiences their election by the power of the precursor. Bloom calls this poetic thinking, thereby bringing us back to philosophy. If we can say that poetic thinking concerns what it means to be, and thus lies in closest proximity to philosophy, its asociality nevertheless distinguishes such thinking from reasoning, philosophy's public face. Thinking, whether poetic or philosophical, is not reasoning. It is what Heidegger called Besinnung, attending mindfully to meaning, the inconspicuous. But if meaning comes to presence in poetry only in an exemplary way through the canonical text, and if philosophy can avail itself of no such exemplar, then philosophy cannot do without its classics. Only there, thanks to the classics' ties to its time, can we find the mature trace of the inconspicuous. At this point, the significance of the vita contemplativa for the humanities and for the university comes into view. For these days, there remain precious few places where one has the time to ponder what is at stake in the agon that yields a work of art, or in a thinking that is otherwise than reasoning. Section 4, final section, Finnegan, begin again, the vita contemplativa. In considering the situation of humanistic learning in today's university, I confess that I'm at a distinct disadvantage. I can talk endlessly about my impressions, prejudices, hopes, and fears, but I'm in no position to present these as results based on knowledge of the situation. Concerning all the things that one might want to know about such matters, I have nothing to offer but opinions, which, as we all know, are a dime a dozen. It seems to me that things are not so good in the humanities at the moment. Some of the reasons for this are, it seems to me, internal to the humanistic disciplines themselves. For instance, their increasingly exclusive focus on politics, and some have to do with their status in the modern research university and the broader society. For instance, the difficulty of incorporating them into a cost-benefit analysis. These two things seem linked. On the other hand, I teach at Rice University in a tenured position, and I in no way take this experience to be representative. A well-known, yet to me still shocking statistic. 40 years ago, when I began my career, 75% of faculty positions in the United States were tenure track, while 25% were not. Today, those figures are reversed. It strikes me that humanistic scholarship is threatened under such conditions. But maybe we're simply returning to something like the situation that obtained in the early 20th century when humanistic scholarship was produced primarily at a handful of graduate institutions. The few tenure track positions that remain to us should then be able to produce all the scholarship that's needed in the humanities. After all, what is the need for humanistic scholarship? For a long time now, the job market in humanities has been such that every college and university can insist that all hires publish at a rate that was previously expected only of faculty at top 10 graduate institutions, and often not even there. This nominally adheres to Wilhelm von Humboldt's ideal of uniting teaching and research, certainly not a bad thing, but it doesn't look like a sustainable model when most of those who are called upon to be such scholars are in non-tenured positions that can be eliminated at will by state legislatures or by budget-minded administrators. But why, one might ask, does good scholarship in the humanities require tenure? The argument that tenure is necessary to ensure academic freedom concerns the content of some scholarship or speech and the political positioning of some scholars. But is there a broader argument? I think there is, but it is not one that admits of social scientific confirmation or that underwrites the kind of justification demanded by those who require that the humanities justify themselves. Baldly stated, tenure is necessary because good humanistic scholarship derives in large measure from the vita contemplativa and must respect its imperatives. Tenure acknowledges that the practices and habits that belong to the humanities require a temporality that, from the point of view of productivity measures and outcome assessments, will leave its privileged devotees often appearing to do nothing at all and will leave their genuine students unable to say what it is they have learned. It's not a good place to be. For long stretches of time, it might be quite impossible to distinguish the genius from the dead wood, or from the overproducer, for that matter. This is certainly not optimal in an institution that depends on funding from state legislatures or private donors who reasonably do not want to underwrite dead wood. But that is not the sort of institution in which the vita contemplativa originally found its home, nor was the sort of study it made possible designed for an institution that measures success in terms of continuous productivity and practical applications. If we call the kind of study that hews most closely to the vita contemplativa the humanities, then the humanities, far from being the heart and soul of a modern research university, don't really belong there at all. Of course, it's not impossible that good scholarship will emerge in an institution that increasingly flees its ivory tower image in favor of forthright integration into the marketplace. Cranking out article after article, book after book is good exercise. And all that activity means, statistically, that there is every likelihood that brilliant work will be produced and true humanistic learning fostered somewhere. What will not be fostered are the virtues that belong to the life of mind, which accrue only to the vita contemplativa and cannot be instrumentalized. A capacity for attentive, mindful reflection, a habitus of being alert to one's prejudices, an openness to aspects of things that escape the useful or the political, a delight in the unhurried exploration of ideas, following trails where they lead, making associations, Besinnung, Gelassenheit, and so weiter. This is anything but an argument for doing theory as opposed to more obviously practical interventions into whatever may be taken to be pressing issues of the day. Theories are guides for practice, whether technical, as was early deconstruction, or critical, devoted to pointing out those oppressive structures the idols of the tribe are meant to conceal. Indeed, it's almost a cliche that the tacit norm governing scholarship in the humanities today, theoretical or otherwise, the basis of its self-understanding is Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Hitherto, philosophy has only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. Can't argue with that. It's well beyond my competence to say whether the overwhelming number of books and articles written under this assumption contributes to the betterment of humankind. But pursuing theory in this sense does not foster the virtues of the vita contemplativa. And so, on the alternative model of theoria that I draw from my own discipline, it is part of the problem, not part of the solution. Theoria is pure looking or contemplating, and the leisure, schole, that it requires is useless, not pursued for some purpose beyond itself. It is a way of being something, not a way of doing something. Thus, it cannot be justified in terms of its results, be they cognitive, technical, political, or ethical. By way of explaining this point, I can only invoke a few ideas from Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind, the most perceptive phenomenological account of the difference between thinking and knowing that I've found. Nihilism, as Nietzsche observed, is a pathological condition. The dread that life has no meaning. Such pathology bespeaks a failure not of knowledge, but of thinking. Thinking, according to Arendt, is therapy for nihilism, but thinking is just what is disappearing from our academic lives because the quest for meaning, she says, is absent from and good for nothing in the ordinary course of human affairs. Thinkers are the inconspicuous ones because thinking requires withdrawal from the world of appearances into a kind of solitude that seeks something ineffable in the words of everyday discourse. Thinking, then, is a kind of remembrance, or Andenken, of what is inconspicuously there along with the appearances. And such mnemosyne cannot be accomplished without the help of metaphor. In its quest for meaning, says Arendt, thinking is, quote, in no way different from our need to tell the story of some happening or write a poem about it. Thinking, then, belongs to the humanities. But early on, when integrated into the project of philosophy, thinking's use of metaphor produced an unfortunate confusion between thinking and knowing. Philosophy took its metaphors from the field of sight, evidence, eidos, theoria, nous, all of which entail an object outside themselves. But even if Hegel was right that knowing can grasp its object as a result, thinking's quest for meaning leaves no trace outside the activity itself. It delights in its own activity. But its object, or better, its concern, is permanently at issue and cannot be fixed in a proposition. A better set of metaphors comes from hearing. The thinker is addressed by meaning and is called upon to answer, but in the form of the quest itself. Questioning, as Heidegger put it, is the piety of thinking, where piety is loving observance of what thinking demands. I hasten to add that philosophy, as it is currently practiced, does little to foster the vita contemplativa in this sense. One does not need to invoke applied philosophy to see that philosophy, too, is practiced largely in the form of theory. The conceptual framework, these days mostly drawn from natural science, is adopted and applied to problems whose esoteric character arises from a research model geared toward the production of dissertations and publications. Does physics entail the non-existence of tables and chairs? Does the closest possible world to our own contain zombies? Does the hedonic calculus ethically require the elimination of the human species? Very interesting. These are real topics. Very interesting and even brilliant work can come from doing philosophy in this theory way, and in any case, something like it is necessary when one's livelihood depends on publishing. But it cannot substitute for the primary process of thoughtfully following the trace of the inconspicuous, the cultivation of judgment. My elegiac tone, however, does not arise from some blanket judgment on the humanities today. It is elicited by the worry that if the modern university continues to squeeze out the vita contemplativa, with its time-squandering uselessness, occasional frivolity, apparent self-indulgence, valorization of inwardness, passion, and eros, it will be increasingly difficult to sustain the humanities, aspects of which can neither be produced on demand nor predicted on the basis of the job candidate's CV. So it seems we cannot avoid Lenin's question after all. What is to be done? One thing we can perhaps say is that Humboldt's idea of Bildung, of education that addresses the whole individual as opposed to focusing on the development of skills or the attainment of expert knowledge, is itself already beholden to the sort of socio-technical imperatives expressed in Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. And so it already stands in tension with the vita contemplativa. Bildung aims at an ethos of autonomy and a certain form of citizenship, and I'm all for it. But I'm not convinced that a university structured around research and utility, if it lacks a firm grip on what liberal thought is, has the ethical consequences claimed for it. Be that as it may, Jean-François Lyotard long ago pointed out that neither the idealist meta-narrative of Bildung nor the emancipatory meta-narrative of critical theory is convincing anymore as a rationale for structuring knowledge in the university. We humanists should not be surprised by this, since the very demand for such a rationale is an affront to the vita contemplativa. The latter is pursued for its own sake, is its own reward, and it is not intrinsically devoted to responsible citizenship or political duty. If it is devoted to anything at all, it can only be the greater glory of God. This does not mean that research in the humanities is useless. For all I know, the treatise is now being written about the environmental crisis, the transhuman, evolutionary ethics, cultural appropriation, medical imaging, global energy market, and the like, will have beneficial effects and make us better able to recognize and do what is right and good. But until such a connection is established, the humanities will seem more or less indefensible, more or less a matter of asserting, with the considerable rhetorical power that many of us humanists develop, that what we do is essential to a democratic citizenry, that without a knowledge of history, we're doomed to repeat it, that philosophy teaches critical thinking, that literature makes us more open to other perspectives, that art contributes to our repertoire of ways of knowing. And if all else fails, we can recall that the skills we impart are useful in medical school, or law school, or consulting, or that we alone speak truth to power, or whatever. I mean, I'm not against any of these ideas. I mean, they're all true, but they haven't convinced anybody, really. You know? Much as it irks some to admit it, there are no results in philosophy. This does not mean that there is no knowledge there, but it does mean that any standard of success that depends on measuring output, whether ethical in Humboldt's sense, or more scientific, as Husserl imagined, is bound to distort what is at stake in philosophy. And it seems to me this point holds of all the humanities. But while the measure of success in the humanities derive from the form of life in which they are at home, vita contemplativa, just this form of life seems imperiled by the priorities of today's university. In this sense, the humanities are indeed in crisis, the turning point in a disease when a decision must be made. Because we have only the vaguest sense for the context in which successful humanistic study can develop, we have lost most of our understanding of what measures such success, nor can we articulate those measures to our students. Or maybe I should use the first person singular, just to be quite honest about it. In any case, this is an exaggeration. The vita contemplativa is here and there alive and well. But the more the university is called to justify itself on the basis of outcomes, results, practical applications, citations, patents, grants awarded, number of students going to grad school or law school, skills represented in the curriculum, leadership, writing, new media, IT, and so on, the more difficult it becomes for the university to acknowledge the measures that belong to humanistic work, and thus to promote the virtues of the vita contemplativa in its institutions, centers, and policies. These dangers come in many forms, and I don't have the mots justes that can gather them all together, but like Justice Stewart confronting the pornographic, I know it when I see it. Am I denying that results are important or claiming that skills cannot be measured? No, but we can turn to the matter of writing to illustrate the problem. There is no doubt that we can help our students improve their writing skills, but one thing that cannot be taught because it is not a skill is a concern for good writing. And this alone is essential to the humanities. The barbarous character of much current writing in the humanities, under the imperatives of pseudoscientificity, bricoleur virtuosity, saccharine solidarity, and the frenzied demand for publication, testifies to the loss of what matters most, a kind of eros toward the written word, a recognition that one cannot do justice to one's thinking, one's human connection to the world, without loving its expression, without feeling physically and morally compromised by bad writing. One may be born with this feeling, or it can dawn on one, draw one to it in time, but it is not a skill. It is fostered in the same way that respect for one's thinking is fostered, in a kind of eros that feels out of joint when thinking is motivated by something other than its own imperatives. This is what the vita contemplativa both requires and promotes, but when writing is gathered up with other communication skills, such as visual literacy or the ability to manipulate new media, much of this is lost. From the point of view of the vita contemplativa, writing is not communication at all. Who am I communicating with? Myself? It's a form of thinking. I cannot say whether manipulating new media is a form of thinking. But language and writing are not tools, and our ability to speak and write are not skills. I take some comfort in the fact that the vita contemplativa is by no means an exclusively Western phenomenon, and so cannot be summarily dismissed as culturally chauvinistic. I will admit, however, to valuing the way it came to be bound up in ancient Greece with philosophy, the practice of argument and justification. Certainly, once my vita contemplativa encounters yours, that is, once we begin to compare notes on what our thinking, mulling, and reflecting has led us to believe, say, and cherish, differences of opinion are likely to arise, and reasoning becomes inevitable. Or perhaps not exactly inevitable. Another equally possible response is simply to dig in one's heels, cancel the heretic or infidel, and take one's acolytes with one. Do we suppose that the humanities can decide which of these possibilities is the best way to go? I don't think so. The humanities cultivate judgment, but only individuals pass judgment. If those individuals content themselves with moral and political scolding, I'm afraid that we're in for a pretty rough ride. But as Curtius illustrated, we still have work to do in whatever monastic cell is left to us, recollecting the essential in a situation of broken, almost blind transmission. There is no guarantee that anything will come of this such contemplation, but without cultivating that space and acknowledging its own imperatives, we humanists are left with nothing to guide us but theory or theology. topic for another day. And that means politics. But politics is no guide to the kind of questions we're tasked with addressing. Questions that concern the bindingness of culturally instantiated measures and norms expressing our commitments about what it means to be a human being. In our globalized moment, the hope seems to be that such questions can be addressed through expanded cultural literacy. But while the merits of such literacy cannot be denied, it won't really help us. We already know that life is lived differently elsewhere, and if we're searching for better ways of doing things, better ways of being, we must admit that the standard will remain at issue for us. Or do we imagine that the virtue of another way of life simply announces itself? Thinking about such things requires the temporality of the vita contemplativa, the leisure to cultivate our judgment by reflecting on the meaning that inconspicuously sustains all we see and do. What steps must the university take if it's to foster the virtues of the vita contemplativa and so do justice to the intrinsic imperatives of humanistic inquiry? I cannot say. As an empirical matter, however, actually existing universities appear to have little interest in such virtues. Hence my dime a dozen opinion that the humanities are endangered. How then are we humanists to make our case? You got me. I'm not a marketing specialist. But those of us who hold a view similar to what I've outlined here may not be thrilled by the opportunities for collaboration mandated by university consolidation into synergistic research programs that show little concern for the character of humanistic learning. Defending such learning in terms of the intrinsic value of the useless or the necessity of leisure won't cut ice in most places. Perhaps our only recourse, if we can survive the tenure process, is to try to exemplify such things so that students might get a glimpse of what they mean. Rice University generously provided me a space to try out these idiosyncratic ideas, and for that I am grateful beyond measure. My fondest hope is that it will continue to be such a place, recognizing that the humanities are not well served when they are measured by standards not their own, no matter how essential such marketing is for preserving the fragments of the vita contemplativa left to us. Thank you. Thank you for enduring and listening to this long and winding argument that has been bugging me for 40 years. Go on. But I'm stalling because the setup is not supposed to actually happen until in about 15, 20 minutes. So if there are any questions or comments, I'm most happy to. Tim, I think.
Can I ask for kind of like a fun inside baseball discussion about Wittgenstein?
Yeah.
So, it's hard to not, open a book that starts with the world is all that is the case. Or, to have this extended discussion about philosophy showing the fly the way out of the fly bottle. And I think that has a virtue that isn't just the virtue of good argument. And do you feel like some philosophers have canonized Wittgenstein or Wittgenstein?
Yeah, and they become saints to the Wittgenstein world, yeah.
So do you feel like that specific kind of work hasn't called to you? Do you feel its force as something other than argument?
Do you mean the issue that you might say, well, instead of solving problems, you dissolve them?
But not
That's the fly bottle.
Yeah, not the idea, but the expression of those ideas. Like the way that, especially at the very beginning of the Tractatus is written, and then the way that a lot of investigations is written.
Yes, yeah, no, I mean, I think these experimental forms is what I'd call them. I mean, Tractatus, all the stuff is going on around in, unseen, the Wizard of Oz, sort of behind the scene. And so I find the logical form precious. But the stuff he says around it, and the fly bottle thing, I think that's a good metaphor. I mean, he uses a lot of metaphors, and that I'm not a Wittgenstein expert, so I haven't actually read his lectures on aesthetics, stuff like that. But yeah, no, I mean I would say that a lot of what he's doing in the investigations is a kind of phenomenology, and it's getting us to think about things and see things in a different way that then might it's always under the guise of, well, I'm criticizing some dogma that philosophers have been under the spell of for generations, decades, whatever. And he tends to leave explanations out, which I think that's, I guess, the phenomenological dimension that I would emphasize in Wittgenstein, and what I value in Wittgenstein. And I didn't really say a lot about what phenomenology is here, except to say, oh yeah, well, it's like making room for the inconspicuous and things like that. And I feel an affinity for what Wittgenstein is doing in that. Of course, it's no accident, therefore, that Wittgenstein is entirely shut out from, major philosophy departments. I mean, he gets, you're either a devotee, right? You're either part of the church or the rest of the people ignore that. And so, not unlike phenomenology. So, yeah, I think that's right. And the use of these metaphors, I think, fosters thinking rather than, the desire for results. But I hope I didn't give the impression that argumentation was not valuable. I mean, I think philosophy is philosophy and thinking is something else. And I think that if there were more thinking in philosophy, it would be better, just as an academic discipline. But on the other hand, this by no means, and the same I would say for theory. I mean, I'm not really. There are theories I like and theories I don't like, but so I'm not trying to rule out what's going on, but add a little something that gets missed. And I think that something is absolutely essential to the humanities. I just hope that, people, they know it when they see it too. And I think people who spend a lot of time and care passionately about literature, art, poetry, history, the whole gamut of humanistic discipline, when they think about it, and spend their lives doing it. None of this stuff I was saying is unknown or foreign to people who actually engage in these works. It's just the institution, I mean, I can't do anything about that. And, it's like every other problem in the world today, we see them, and then you start to say, well, there's absolutely nothing I can do about them, And I never say this to students because, I'm old and I can get away with it, but I don't want students to get that idea because somebody's got to do something down there. They're smarter than I am. They're learned. They had more, more time, more richness of experience. They lived through times that I was sitting around in the vita contemplativa the whole time, and so I would not want to. And again, I'm by no means criticizing critique, interest in politics. These are, ethics, interdisciplinary work, applied work. These are, these need no defense from me, right? They're around, people are doing them and they're doing them well. I'm making just a little argument for saying there's something that I didn't say is lost, but I said could be lost under that, the new regime, so to speak. Well, it's not so new, it's been around since the 20s and 30s, but, and hot to trot since the 50s for sure, the university. Sure, yes. Good to see you.
That was really moving. Thank you so much for this talk and for your 4 years of wisdom. I was really struck by your, rejection of the pagistifications of what we do in terms of skills, and loved the attention that you gave to care for these skills, concern for these skills. And when thinking then about how the humanities need to be evaluated by their own terms and standards, is there a way that you think that this institution, other institutions can actually take seriously the kind of concern that students can come to have for these skills that do really come to life in our humanities classrooms in a way that's so different, right? We hear this so much from our students who have multiple majors, who have been trained in so many ways, but the kind of concern, that is something that so often, right, professors like you are able to awaken. So how do we figure out how to get the administration to quantify what cannot be quantified? How do we engage alumni through oral arguments? What is it that we need, and how do we take this up and frankly weaponize it? Because this is what we do as a labor of love, but also needs to be seen as a strength that has some kind of market value, and that is actually changing these students in the world.
I mean, I think those two things are in deep tension. I mean, I can't tell you what market value the Vita Contemplativa has. I know I can't. But I think that, I mean, one thing, and I haven't studied any of this. Like I say, these are all this, I don't even know what's going on campus. But you have a most humanists, right, teach writing at some level in their classes. I mean, they, at the very least, they mark up a paper or write some comments on the paper. But there's so many. It's hard to inculcate what I was calling this care or concern for good writing because it isn't a skill. That's my point, right? It's just not a skill. And so when it depends on the people, the people who are teaching courses like in the writing center or something. If the aim is simply to be able to write up a resume or something, present an elevator pitch or that has a really practical goal, and or how to write a paper with 3 ideas in it or something. I mean, we need that. We need all of that. And my only hope is that whoever's teaching those courses has that concern for good writing that goes beyond it. I mean, I guess you could say the same thing about writing workshops, creative writers. Write what you know. Okay, so that we get 10 million stories about sitting around drinking coffees. And, write what you know is good, but literature is an imaginative sort of process. And when you're imagining something, you can either just write whatever comes into your mind, or you can sort of say, well, how do these pieces really want to come together? How do they really want to work? When am I going to know this is done? I mean, when am I going to know that I'm through revising? I never know. I mean, if a paper sits around, I just keep poking at it, and it's never finished. But practical instructions, it's up to people. If you hire people that are attuned to this sort of thing and can engage with students through the product that they're producing for this writing workshop or exercise, if you can get through to that person, and here I'm revealing my teaching methods, I'm revealing my character as a reprobate. I think shame goes a long way. Seriously, you know, I mean, I'm not talking about the coddling of the American mind here, but I mean, you know, people, you'll get arrested for shaming somebody. And, you know, but I do it anyway in my classes. And I think people don't mind it, they get it, you know, and that's what wakes you up to care, or, I mean, this notion of care is Heidegger's notion that I'm borrowing, but I'm tying it to this eros and concern for good writing that you know, it's kind of like it's like respect for yourself, something like that. How do you teach people respect for themselves? I don't know, but it was important. Anyway, are you ready up here? Well, we can party it up then. If everybody's welcome to the goodies outside. And thank you.